when I think about just kind of this denial of ego, I mean, the ego is our ally, just as the body is our ally. I guess the question of like, well, what part of us is really us, you know? Is it the body? Is it the soul? Is it the ego? And I think they all are to some extent. But I think the function of the ego is to kind of keep us safe. And, you know, it's our narrative and biographical self. And it really can serve that journey towards, like, I guess, spiritual realization, but it really needs to be tended to and cared for because it's how we show up in the world.
What is the soul? Is there life after death? And what does the psychedelic experience in the experience of life show us here? Well, we're about to join Eric, Debbie, and Jasmine in a collaboration of curiosity, exploring at the edge of what can be said about these enduring questions. You're listening to Psilocybin Says. To support it, subscribe on YouTube and podcasts, stay connected on Instagram and TikTok, and of course, join the conversation in the comments.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Psilocybin Says. We are back on the topic of deathadelic, the word that came to my head this afternoon, but the subject of dying psychedelically. We've got a couple of wonderful guests here joining us. Jasmine, welcome to Psilocybin Says for your first visit.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for having me.
Yeah,
I'm super
absolutely
excited to be here.
Absolutely. And Debbie, good to see you again, as always. So I know you two have not met each other yet. You maybe are peripherally exposed to each other's work, but I thought it might be a good idea for Jasmine, if you could kind of introduce yourself to Debbie, how you've got introduced into psychedelics and kind of this intersection of end-of-life care around the topic of psychedelics.
Yeah, you know, I've been in the psychedelic space, I guess, working in different capacities for the last 5 or 6 years now, although I've been in the larger space, I think, for about 10 years. And yeah, you know, I mean, I personally started my personal explorations out of a spiritual kind of inquiry, and that led me later to starting to write about psychedelics. And I also volunteered for Fireside Project, or still volunteer for them. So Fireside Project is a psychedelic support line that people can call and text if they're having a psychedelic-related crisis or if they're looking for support with integration. You know, I guess things that I do in the space, I work for a publishing company called Synergetic Press, and also teach on Psychedelics Today's Vital Training Program. So, you know, I wear many different hats, but I think I just kind of come to, you know, the topic, I guess, with a burning kind of desire to learn more about the numinous. And I think that's what's led me to, you know, writing about these things. You know, and I will say that I'm no expert on psychedelics and death, but I did just, you know, I wrote this one piece about it a few years ago for Chacruna Institute that I think we'll discuss a little bit today. But yeah, so I think that's a little bit more about me, and I'm sure you'll learn more over the course of this conversation. Yeah, nice to meet you, Debbie.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I would say that, I mean, I think a similar path in that looking for psychedelics really only like about 2.5, maybe 3 years ago, partook in a psychedelic ceremony with a shaman, with a mixture of psychedelics actually, but primarily mushrooms. And that really, I already had like a love for mushrooms in themselves, like just an infatuation with them. And actually, when I went into that experience, I was really like almost like, I'm going to say a little bit afraid, but still also like, you know, looking forward to experiencing it. And then after that, you know, that has a way of changing you a little bit. And it's been a progression since then. However, also in the middle of that, I started hospice volunteering and got acquainted a little bit more about end of life and started thinking about my own. And also it was interesting in the in the dying process, how some people experienced it completely different and their family than others. And the ones that stick out to me and kind of to me aligned with what I'd experienced in the psychedelic space was they would literally, I had one patient one time pack her bag. I'm going on a journey. I'm going on a trip. And she was like all excited about this trip. And she was in probably a space just because of where she was going into a transition state. But she literally was excited about going into this experience. And I thought how beautiful that is. And if we're able to help facilitate that for more people, rather than suffering through it, find joy and growth in it, how beautiful that would be. And became an end-of-life doula to also help support in other ways that I'd say would replicate integration. In a sense, I mean, it's got a little bit more business to it, like legal stuff and all of that. But, integrating about thinking about your life and leaving a legacy and, all the beautiful things that if you're not relaxed, if you don't accept where you are, you miss. And psychedelics help, open that door.
So this was a client that was excited about her trip into the afterlife, not a psychedelic trip.
Right.
Oh, wow. That's so cool.
Because what I've observed is that people leave their body. There's a very interesting transition that happens towards the end where you're less in your human body and you're more in the spiritual world. That's why they say people see their ancestors and they see people they love and maybe their pets. It's because they literally have one foot here and one foot over there.
Which is akin to the psychedelic experience itself, right? And, I mean, I'm curious, Jasmine, you said that you understand psychedelics from a spiritual perspective, as I think we all have in common here. But I wonder if you could kind of tease that out a little bit more. What does that mean to you? How do you understand psychedelic spirituality?
Oh, what a potent question. I think we all have very idiosyncratic approaches to it, but I think a lot of my personal, my psychedelic spirituality, I would say, is informed by animism and kind of ecosomatics. And I think that also can relate to death in a larger sense, because it informs obviously how I personally understand death and dying. But I think that I just kind of understand it as a connecting to something larger, and whether we want to call that like nature or the earth or other people, or something beyond this earth that's transcendent and cosmic, or even, to entities and beings from other dimensions, but there's this sense of dissolution of self. The narrative and biographical self kind of melts away into something much larger that, not always, but is often self also. I say not always because I think in ayahuasca experiences, you can, or in DMT experiences, sometimes you meet entities, you're like, oh, this isn't part of me, this is someone or something who's completely distinct and different and that's very new. And so I think that, that kind of ecology informed, I guess, ecosomatic perspective, I think it also informs like how I look at death as well, because I really like to use like, and this is something, how to say this? Yeah, my uncle actually passed away last Friday, so it's something that's kind of with me, now as I go through my own tending to grief process. And I think that, without having supported other people as they're going through the dying process specifically, but having been through my own processes of grieving, I really feel that there is a kind of like a composting. I really like that word, because it is not final, and I think we have this, illusory construct in our culture that kind of portrays death as like an end, as something final. And of course it is an end of something. It marks a transition. And for the people left behind grieving, there's a feeling of like, there's a feeling of rupture of love with that person who has then left you. But I think that metaphor of composting really kind of helps me lean into it, because there's a sense of erosion and breakdown that leads into more nourishment. And I think that grief can be like that. And I think also that can be comforting for people who are in that process of, having, in that end of life process too, of just kind of knowing that not knowing, but having faith, I suppose, that there is something more, and my body, my spirit, even though it's all unknown, will go on to nourish something else.
I want to ask, and I hope you don't care, I hope you don't mind. This seems to be really valuable in this conversation, particularly in terms of psychedelics and the intersection of death and the possibility of afterlife. As Debbie was describing, kind of moving on to something else, and you're speaking of disincarnate entities, which I would say, if you're not experiencing those with psilocybin, then just maybe take higher doses, because they're out there with mushrooms too. Just saying. It's not just ayahuasca, but it seems like this conversation is kind of like almost conspicuously absent in a lot of the psychedelic community, and understandably so. We are approaching psychedelics in a very Western medical scientific understanding, which is great. There's a lot of value there. But it seems like this conversation around death, particularly with psychedelics, has the potential to open us up to a broader conversation about maybe exploring realities beyond this one, or realities that even interface with this one, right? So from my understanding, like the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a lot of these are manuals and trying to help us learn in this life how to transition and navigate into the next life, which seems really valuable and sorely missing from our kind of current paradigm. So I wonder, like, there's a lot that we could unpack there. I'd love to dig into it as much as we can. And since you brought up this idea of, beings outside of ourself in realms beyond, I wonder if you could maybe speak to maybe just like your perspective on the soul as it perhaps exists outside of the body. Does that make sense, Jasmine?
Yeah, it does. I kind of have this very agnostic perspective, and I think I draw from various different cultures, but I do know that, in thinking about just this state of kind of ego death, I think that, was it in the 60s, Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner published the book, The Psychedelic Experience, which, was really deeply informed by the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And kind of like, it was kind of a manual in a way to kind of help people navigate that, experience of death during a psychedelic experience. And I think in the article that I've shared with you all, I did write about Laura Huxley sitting with Aldous Huxley as he died of laryngeal cancer. And, he was hoping for a long time that he would get better, pushing off psychedelics. I don't think he had them for the last 2 years of his life. But then he had this request to, have an intravenous dose of LSD, and he had, I think it was 200 micrograms in the end. But, I think that was also informed by just this understanding of, his personal understanding that it would help him travel through that bardo, that liminal space between life and death. And I think that many cultures, whether it's purgatory or the bardo, I'm sure there are other names in other cultures that I'm unaware of, but there is a liminality, right, in that process of transition. And, I guess Huxley and others have wanted to use psychedelics to help with that transition. Or, Debbie, you mentioned being a death doula. I think just having that loving accompaniment also to help someone transition in those moments can be so helpful to the person to find grace, because I think, obviously, this is all speculative as someone who is not going through, a death experience myself, but has been through, various death experiences informed by psychedelics. I think that there is a deep fear that can emerge in that transition, in that moment of uncertainty, in that liminal space. And so to have that support to guide you through that. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah. There's no necessarily a right answer there. It's just exploring this, and that's where, Debbie, I wonder if you could share maybe some of this crossover that you might have experienced in. I love how you mentioned that when someone is leaving their body, transitioning, that it's a gradual process. And this kind of visual metaphor of the composting of the spirit or of the being is like, as a mushroom grower, like I've always said, I'm a dirt maker, right? Like mushrooms are the great composters. And so what a wonderful kind of visual for the self as it goes through that. And how have you experienced that, Debbie? How have you seen that playing out for people? I've got a number of stories that I could share, but I'd rather hear from you right now as to how you're seeing that play out, and like, how does that become, like, how do we further engage with that as we start to understand it as part of the process?
Yeah. And it was helpful to me in the beginning to also think about it in contrast to birth, not contrast even. Okay. So, we get all excited about a new baby coming into the world, which is just a soul that just transitioned into this existence. And I'm like thinking, man, when I compared it to the exit, I'm like, first of all, thinking they both should be celebrated, but also thought about the transition of a baby that needs nurturing, right? And it needs, as it comes into this space, how do we know this isn't the most difficult transition, coming into this body versus leaving it, so that to me was helpful. And then also, when we talk about this difference between somebody who's at peace, going, even if they're not actively in the dying process, I think the earlier we do this, the better. But I've noticed people that I've worked with psychedelics in this life-threatening illness, maybe they have stage 4 cancer, they have, congestive heart failure, and they, maybe have, not in hospice yet, maybe, but know that this is a progressive illness that they will, sooner than later, probably die from. And if they're able to, once they get in that psychedelic experience, when the fear, and they get to see into the other side, that helps the fear relieve, and it helps them just live at every moment so much better. So, and I don't even know if it's the fear. Some of it's fear. Some of it is seeing the beauty. And to your point, Jasmine, about seeing the larger existence and, the joy there, they're kind of getting a glimpse into where they're heading, right? They're seeing a documentary on Costa Rica, like they're going somewhere. So they get to experience it ahead of time. Is very helpful to be in a good space whenever they do make that transition. Now, others I've worked with that haven't taken psychedelics, they can be in if they're in a really poor way, and their family can be months of stress, just super intense stress. And the idea of spending the rest of your last days or your last months in that kind of environment, I think is awful. I've done some things that have helped on the energetic level. Like, so if they can't, they, aren't open to psychedelics, I've used Reiki to help move their energy, and that kind of helps a little bit, the Reiki part of it, even if it doesn't heal the body. And it might have some healing effects, but it's really about healing that soul, comforting that soul at that point too. It's definitely not as effective and efficient as psychedelics, but again, it's getting that person in that space. And a step towards it is being able to pass away at home. I mean, at least we're going into that direction, that you're not in a clinical setting, which to me would be even more traumatic for me, to be in a hospital and face my end of life. So I think right now about 50% are able to make that transition at home, and hopefully that'll get higher.
So when you're seeing people who are crossing over and separate out the psychedelic experience from that for a minute, what kind of parallels are you seeing between the two experiences?
Between birth,
if any? No, between the dying experience and the psychedelic experience.
The psychedelic experience,
and maybe you're not seeing any.
Oh no! I mean, I think in the dying experience, see, most people, when they're going into their last few days, they're going to be sleeping. Okay, and which could also be like a psychedelic experience in terms of they're inwards. They are all inside. So by that time, they're not eating, their body's not functioning really that much, just breathing, but they certainly aren't eating. They're not, doing the normal bodily functions. Compared to psychedelics, I mean, of course, that's not the case, but usually you're going inward to some extent. But they definitely are not very conscious, so they're inside. You can still tell and feel their energy, like things going on, but most often it's already that they're in that space, that spiritual space. Now, the difference is people that have had psychedelics, when they go in there, so if you go into that transition, you're calm, you're there, but you're not flattling. Like people that are still fighting it, they might go into that kind of not, sleep state, but their arms are flattling, their feet are kicking, they're fighting it. I mean, and they'll fight it longer for days. They'll hang on in that semi-comatose state, versus somebody that has had psychedelics. Now, how does that compare to the psychedelic experience? I think the people that have experienced psychedelics before going in that transition have surrendered. They've accepted and they surrendered. So if I compare that to the psychedelic space, people that don't surrender to the psychedelics and fight it and are fearful have a different experience than those that surrender to it. Am I right? Or don't feel it?
I still struggle with giving into the psychedelic experience, and that seems to make sense. I mean, I personally, I have a great personal interest as my ontology has continued to shift, and I likewise, Jasmine, come with this agnostic. I don't know what's going on, right? We're kind of like putting pieces of the puzzle together, and for quite a while I was very much camp no afterlife, and then within the psychedelic space started to experience phenomena that was just, at first I denied it. I kept denying it, but the evidence mounted where there is activity in the invisible world that can interface with this world. And so the potential for this conversation and this practice to expand our, I like the word, the ecology of spirit, this kind of experience of all of the worlds mingled together. Like even like this birth, you're talking about this birth transition. I never thought about it this way. I wonder if there's anybody over there helping us, transition into this world.
Exactly.
But, like when Courtney was pregnant with our daughter, she was communicated with before the inception. Like she was told that we were going to have a daughter during a mushroom trip, and she met our daughter before she was even conceived, right? And so as someone who's kind of newly converted in the last couple of years to this, okay, there's another world that is existent beyond this one, and it sometimes they bleed into each other. I find myself more and more curious about how we can kind of consciously engage and just kind of interface with the two. So it seems like seeing similar phenomena from the psychedelic space as in the death space, or perhaps even in the birth space, can really inform our cosmology in a much more rich sense of the word. Jasmine, are you what Debbie and I are kind of within the sanctuary world. Most of our psychedelic work and communication, I think, is happening here within this little ecosystem of sanctuary. But within the broader psychedelic world that you're involved in, how is this conversation around spirituality, death and dying, and psychedelics evolving? What are you seeing and hearing out there?
Yeah, I think, I appreciate the conversation that does center around spirituality, death, and dying, because it, like you said, I think earlier, that there is this massive focus, at least in the global north, of like pushing psychedelics into like an allopathic, medicine format. They're being medicalized, they're being psychologized, they're used for therapy, and it's very specific, to, I guess, just the frameworks we have, I think, for sense making in like Western culture. And then you go to, you sit with Wiraraka peoples and you have peyote, or hikuri as they call it, or you go to the Amazon and you drink ayahuasca, or with the Mazatec and, have Niño Santos, psilocybin mushrooms. There's so many different ontologies and ways that these substances, these plants, these medicines are being understood that goes beyond this very narrow funnel of like medicalization. And so I think that this conversation around death and dying, and Debbie also mentioned birth, like it's so beautiful to think about, like how well to look to other cultures and look how these substances are integrated. What are they being used for? Because they kind of embody, like for me personally, and I think they embody this trickster space where they define categorization in many ways, and we're really trying hard to like stay off the corners and
aren't we though?
And saying this is what psychedelics are, they're only medicines, but they're used for shamanic warfare, they're used for rites of passage. And I think with Debbie bringing up birth, I think that it brings up for me like a larger conversation around rites of passage and how those are marked in our culture. And there are so many ways to do that. We don't need psychedelics per se, but I think the ritual and the ceremony to mark those important moments of transition, of liminality in one's life. And, I will say also just about the birth process, I think for Santo Daime people, and Santo Daime is like a syncretic ayahuasca church for those that don't know. In mostly in Brazil, but they have communities worldwide. Like when a baby is born in their tradition, like they'll dip their thumb in ayahuasca and it's very light, and put it in the baby's mouth. And kids in many cultures will also sit with these plants, and so, and I just want to like, I guess, emphasize that like these plants are so many things, and they can mark so many moments of our lives, and whether it be, initiation into this world or transition out of it, I think that they have beautiful roles to play. And beyond the plants themselves, just the role of ceremony and ritual in those moments.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jasmine. I've been beginning to see that there a ritual, the need for a ritual, including psychedelics, for when people retire. I've seen people around me that they just can't handle it. Their ego is so tied up in, their strive, especially in America. I don't know if in other countries, but America, it's like, man, you're so focused on making money and, you working 50, 60 hours a week. And when you retire, you have no identity left, and it crushes people. So what if that became a life transition, a life passage? And yeah, the medicines could help them see and feel a new beginning, a new lease on their life, a new start, if you will.
Oh man, Trevor Noah has a special out on Netflix that recently dropped, and he talks about this, how he went to France and he's like asking people like, so what do you do? Expecting to hear like their job, right? And they're like, oh, I ride bikes, or I do these things. It's like our culture is so, and I do think it is this kind of patriarchal dominator mindset that this is what I do, this is who I am, is I influence the world in this way, rather than considering like, well, how do you live your life, how do you enjoy this time here? And so like, maybe, what do you think about that? Is that kind of something behind this fear of death? Is maybe a subconscious or unconscious realization that I didn't live my life to the fullest?
Well, and even I think that I've seen a lot of people that get to that stage and they literally die within months because they have no other vision into what life could be. And so I feel like when we're talking about death and psychedelics, to me, it could be if you integrated this into your life from, you said birth, like Jasmine, all the way through, and you got to like that in America, let's call it the retirement age, and we're able to open up and see, a new life for you, all these new possibilities, because I think they relate retirement with death. Life's over for me, because up to that point, that might be the only life they know or have appreciated or can relate to with their psyche. So if they could do partake in psychedelics and integration and do some beautiful healing work or transition work, if you want to call it that, at that stage, that would set them up to start that journey towards their last third of life or whatever it might be, and live it instead of in drudgery, in complete, utter joy and all kinds of things.
I want to share it. I'm a little bit hesitant too, because I don't want it to be taken the wrong way, or it's not to say give false hope, because I think it gives very real hope. But of the 5 or 6 stage 4 cancer patients that I've worked with, only one actually passed away. The other 3 went into complete remission after a handful of very deep and profound psychedelic experiences. And at least 2 of them that I can think of right off the bat cited that renewed vision for themselves as what gave them the impetus to live, which begs the question of how to even pose this. And I'm curious what both of you think about this. The spirit's ability to maintain the body, right? This Western world has this view that we are physical, mechanical beings, and with the right nutrients and the right exercise and rah, that we're going to, that's how we're going to extend our life. But what you're speaking to, this idea of purpose, right, has perhaps equal potential to not just give quality to life, but extend life. And I'm just kind of curious what both of you have kind of think around that. Jasmine, why don't you lead us off there?
Yeah, there's this quote, I guess, from Carl Jung, which I'm going to completely butcher, but like he said something to the effect of like a psyche that has like lost meaning will find a way to terminate itself. And I kind of do believe that, because I have seen that very recently in like the passing of family members in the last year, but just like, yeah, I do believe that without that sense of meaning, and I think that we see that in culture all the time, actually, like people who have lost meaning, like, people are chain smokers, people drink alcohol, people eat all of this food that's really terrible for them, or waste time just like numbing themselves through like social media and TV. It's like, well, and I think obviously the social media and TV, maybe it doesn't have that immediate impact on the health, or none of these things do. It's gradual, but I think it is like, and I guess it's kind of like reflective of this like larger crisis we're in as a species, right? But like, why would we choose to do things to ourselves that will ultimately like shorten our lives and are damaging our health? And so I think that, yeah, I do believe that like that sense of meaning that we carry, that sense of purpose and value, like will inevitably like prolong our lives, and I think that when we have meaning, we like choose to kind of commit, I guess, to our health, and all of these different kinds of relationships. So I guess that's kind of what is coming up for me as you asked that question. And yeah, I think I'll end there. There probably is more to say, but if I remember, I'll come back to it.
Well, and if you think about it, isn't that what suicide is? I mean, it's when the person is desperate and sees no meaning and no reason to go on. I've seen it in some older people. They get one of my relatives passed away last year at 98, and it was interesting because he really wasn't sick, but his wife had passed away too, and most of his friends are gone. And one day he just woke up and said, "Yeah, I'm ready to go," and he died in 2 days. He just like he just mentally and yeah, I'm ready to go.
Well,
So
there's you hear stories of at least I've heard stories in like my Pan-African studies of like on the slave ships of shaman or medicine people having the ability to will their spirit out of their body. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Debbie. Go ahead.
No. I guess my what was the point I was making was just that, yeah, it could be gradual, like you talked about, Jasmine, with what people do to themselves. And then there's the, I think our will to live. It's evident, even though it's not not naturally occurring. The suicidal part is, and we see that in a crisis level. Now, I wonder in that area, in that case, if it's just a matter of escaping the pain and they don't know that they don't even care what the beyond looks like. It just couldn't be worse than what I'm feeling today. I don't know. I would love to know that, of people's feelings in that state of, is it to go to someplace better because they know there's a place better, or is it like, I just got to get the hell out of here?
I think it's to get out. Well, there's never an absolute in any of these discussions, as much as we would like there to be. But my experience working with folks and having struggled with suicidal ideation for a large part of my life, it's always been to escape the pain that is, not in the hopes of there being anything better. I want to, if I can, just share this story as it relates. I worked with a guy several times, just an amazing human being. He was a nurse, but very, very troubled. And he came to psilocybin initially to have alleviate these thoughts of taking his own life. And he got quite a bit of relief on his first few rounds with mushrooms, worked together for a while, and kind of found that renewed sense of purpose. And then COVID hit, and worked with him again shortly before COVID. And he is interesting on that experience. We had formed a pretty strong bond. He was from California and came to Jamaica. And in that final experience, he was just walking around the whole time, just like this guardian, huge, big dude. And he was just walking around the whole time like he was just guarding the premises. And he came to me towards the end of his trip, and I knew he just needed space. So he's just doing his thing. And I was watching the whole time, and he came to me at the end of the thing, and he just pulled his sunglasses down. And he said, "Eric, I want you to know that I've always got your back. I've always got your back." And I was just like, "All right, man, I appreciate it, Jason." And the week ended and kind of went our own ways, and we, maintained conversation with him. And, Courtney and I were here at the house, and, at night we'd lay down, and around 11 o'clock things would quiet down. The house was still. For several days in a row, we started hearing things, noises and stuff. And I'm like, what the heck is that? And you get these kind of chills, and like, I'm just imagining shit. It's nothing. And then one night we're laying in the bed, and in the bathroom next to us, a shampoo bottle just falls off the shelf. And I was just like, I got up and went in, and I was just like, cold chills all around. Oh shit. It's the gift that he gave me with bears on it. I had a dream about bears last night. The day after that shampoo bottle fell, I got a call or a text with his obituary, and he had ended up taking his own life. And as soon as I got that text, I was just like, that was him. That was him. God, wow, this is crazy, y'all. And after that realization, nothing ever happened again. There was never any movement in the house whatsoever. Well, I got to show you. I gotta like share this because it's all coming up right here, right now. So, it's gonna seem very weird. When he came to Jamaica, I had there's this spot that I always used to say was the office, is where people would go to purge, and where I would take people and purging what happened. And I always called it the office. And he made this sign for me that he gave to me called the vomit hole.
The vomit hole.
he said he wanted me to hang it in my office. And it got delivered to my in-laws' house while we were in Jamaica. And then about 2 weeks ago, they found it in the attic, and they're like, "Eric, is this yours?" I was like, "Oh yeah, it's from Jason." And last night I had a dream that there was a bear had walked out of the woods. I told Courtney about this morning. Bear walked out of the woods. It was my buddy. It was like straight up my friend, and everybody was like scared of this bear. I was like, "No, it's cool. He's all cool." But nobody was going to fuck with me because there's a bear at my side everywhere I went. Right. And then that didn't even hit till just now seeing this. And so, I share that story because I want so much for the conversation in psychedelics to open up to the reality of the blending of these worlds. And as you bring in the idea of ceremony and ritual and ways that we can more intentionally interface, the hope is that as we intellectually become more aware, experientially become more aware that life does not end, right? That will encourage folks not to give up, because that was the message. This is what's really actually got that story going. The message when I found out that Jason had taken his own life, there was almost this kind of, I want to say, a communication where he was like, "Damn it, Eric, you're right. I'm just going to start back where I left off." because that's what I had told him when he was, we were originally talking about taking his life and stuff. I was like, you can do that, but if you do that, at least this is the conclusion that I've come to, is if we do that, then we're just going to start back where we left off. We don't get to just like, we don't get a reset. We have to keep working through the lessons that we're learning. And so if we can become if we can really understand that life does not end, then we can take the opportunity in this life to love each other better, to love ourselves better, to live more fully, right? So anyway, that was my rant. I'm sorry. Thank you, Jason. That was a nice little communication there, bro. Wow.
Well, I'm curious, Jasmine, in your psychedelic experiences, have you then experienced like another dimension of life, like that, to get a feeling that life goes on? Life is not unending. It's either, it's either in nature. I mean, how have you experienced that? Other beings or relatives or, any of that?
Yeah, I think, I think Eric said earlier, it can happen with all medicines, but for around this particular, like, I guess, interfacing with other beings has mostly happened on ayahuasca for me. And, even with psilocybin, but they feel like very different kind of beings, I should say, and I feel them usually with ayahuasca inside of my body, like all of these different beings, like almost like peering at me from within myself, and kind of pressures, very sensitive, like to the somatics of the experience, but just like, oh, I feel a pressure on the left side of my body, or like there's something there, and I've experienced that also through dreams outside of psychedelic states. And I think I just have this belief, and that belief, I guess, gives me a kind of proclivity. I don't think anyone's special in having these kinds of experiences. I think in the podcast, what's it called, The Emerald, with Joshua Schrei, I think his name is, but he has this beautiful episode called For the Intuitives, and just talks about how mystical experience is really common, actually, and we've just pushed it outside of our culture, and so we kind of like don't have a framework for it, but I think it is very common. And I have had experiences also of like beings that feel otherworldly, beings that feel of this world, like communicating with like minerals and things like that, or moss, and then also with ancestors. I had this very precious experience of like in October of just being in ceremony and feeling these tiny hands, or thousands of hands, pressing on my back, but it was such a light touch. It felt like the touch of feathers or something, and it just felt like this very loving, benevolent, ethereal touch that I had really wanted to see ancestors with. I asked in the beginning of that ceremony, like, oh yeah, like I have an intention to connect to my human and more than human ancestors. And what came up for me, I guess, feeling those hands, I'd ached so much to see like a scene or a face or something, but just that simple presence. And I guess kind of circling back to just this conversation about kind of life after death, and just how these beings might or might not interface with that. I think that one thing that also comes up for me is that in the past, and I came to psychedelics through my interest in spirituality. So I started, from a very young age, reading like Hindu texts and Buddhist texts. And, I was like really, ignited, I guess, by the idea of reincarnation for a long time. And but I was trying to assimilate that into like this very like rational, I guess, intellectual brain, of like, oh, okay, so if this person, this being is no longer in their body, they reincarnate maybe into another being or another person. But then I was like, well, how does that leave space with my rational mind for like, an experience of like a haunted house? Is that a being that hasn't, I guess, transitioned into a new body? And I guess that I don't know if this is making sense, but I think that there is something to be said about like trying to make sense of these experiences of like, disincarnate others, whether they be ancestors or, other beings from other dimensions entirely, through a very like cerebral, rational, cognitive, intellectual interface. And once I kind of like leaned into the notion that like, I guess, yeah, I think that like a linear version of time and space is like a colonial ideal, and like I think that time and space is non-linear, so something can be multiple things at once. And once I really opened myself to that in an embodied way, I was like, well, if a person, because I would read stories about, children that would come to this life and say that, oh, I was this person in this life, or, maybe we have dreams ourselves. And then at the same time, it's like, well, how can someone be like incarnate and disincarnate at the same time? And then but once I really released that notion of like, oh, but it's all non-linear, like it all made sense to me. I was like, well, we can be multiple things at once, even now while I'm incarnate in this body. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense but that's what comes up for me.
I just want to say I've never thought about it before, but perhaps the most insidious weapon of colonialism was the watch. Think about it. Like, I've never thought about that, but like that fucking device that we keeps us tied to this kind of idea of a line that does not exist. And how that's tied to work and this productivity. And the very thing you're talking about, Debbie, is like a life unfulfilled because you spent your time clocking in and out. Boom. Wow. Thank you, ladies. That's some really great
and yet
scenario.
I would say on the other spectrum of mortality, I won't quote this right, but there's a quote supposedly by Achilles that the gods envy us because of our mortality, because if we didn't, we would not spend our time, so I think that goes along with facing death and accepting it and talking about it. That makes the time, not watch time, right? But our time, whatever that is, our here on earth,
our moments
richer and more gratitude for them. So, and I think that's, so, talking about spirituality, and one thing we have not talked about, but I come across a lot in talking with people in this space and death and psychedelics, is like the Christian faith, because it's like, to them, they're just living here to go to heaven, right? There's no purpose or, but oddly enough, they also can be some of the people most afraid. What if there's one thing? What if I didn't do enough Hail Marys? Just that one time I did this thing, so their fear of judgment, their fear of the afterlife is because of the idea of judgment and purgatory. So and the reason I bring that up is because spiritual beliefs do have an impact on death and how you approach death, and also maybe even how you approach psychedelics. I think a lot of people, and I included, grew up in that faith, and just saw how bastardized it was, and none of it made sense. Like, God loves you, but he'll strike you down in a heartbeat. And I'm like, wait a minute, love? What's going on here? So I think people that start questioning whatever they're, and there's aspects probably of every religion that could be not lend itself well to end of life. I don't know, but when we can get curious enough, and when we can go into the psychedelic experience and experience true connection with that source. That's what I tell my Christian friends is like, well, don't you want to, like, if they're life threatening illness, and I'll say, well, I know I'm going to heaven because, you know, Jesus died for my sins. And I'm like, hey, maybe before you go there, would you like to meet Jesus? Like, person to person? You can do that. Like, you don't even have to wait. So, anyway.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to talk about kind of our cultural religiosity, how that impacts our experience with death and dying, and our approach to psychedelics, and how this kind of the coming together of these two worlds of end of life care psychedelic experiences may transform our kind of modern religions. Big comedian fan. We're watching some Jim Gaffigan last night. He had this thing. He said how how, like, you know, God is always saying to his followers, you know, go love each other. And then the followers are going, he said, go kill each other. It's like it's like immediately, how does the interpretation get so fucked? And I do think that psychedelics, I know for me, psychedelics, you know, coming out of the Catholic Church, and the trauma from that, psychedelics not only have helped me recover from that trauma, but have helped me just recontextualize my spirituality. And so, yeah, I'm kind of curious, like, in both of your worlds, maybe where do you see that? How do you see, particularly psychedelics impacting, modern faith practice, if that makes sense, or like starting to evolve current faith practices to something a little more modern? Go ahead, Jasmine.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to thank Debbie for bringing that into the conversation, just like people's individual kind of faiths and religion and culture, because I think, well, yeah, I just, like, on that point, I think it's just so important as people who are facilitating or like supporting people through those states to just have that deep cultural sensitivity and humility. And so I just wanted to name that. And with that awareness, you know, that no faith or no culture is better than another, you know, I think I would start with that premise. And if it was something I didn't know about, just to be curious. But I think that, yeah, I believe at the heart of all, like, many different faiths, and the, you know, I guess Christianity is a one that, you know, people, I guess, you know, including myself, have maybe like had problems with, because it kind of like, you know, because of this idea that you're kind of flawed, you know, that you have sinned. And I think that, you know, Islam too, what I'm trying to say is that I think that in certain traditions, there has been a tendency, at least in, you know, the last few hundred years, to kind of like place the idea of God as outside of oneself and place that relationality with God in the hands of like a priest, or even in Hinduism it's the same also, but you go to like a temple and you know, there's the Brahmin, you know, there's someone mediating that relationship with God. And so I think that something that if people, you know, if that's a path that people choose, is to create a more direct relationship where there's no mediator. I think at their core, all of these traditions like teach about really beautiful things. I think it's just like humans that have like changed the interpretations to restrict and control people, you know. But I think at the core, all of these mystical teachings, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism, Hinduism, like at their core, there's something so beautiful there, so mystical. And I think that, yeah, psychedelics have that ability to put us in contact with that numinous mystical essence of traditions, as opposed to the rules that we have become caught up in following, I think.
The dogma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that you expressed it that way, Jasmine, because I think that's at the crux of it. You experience the core, at least that's been my experience with psychedelics, is cutting through the dogma. And guess what? In that space, at least for me, there is no religion. I mean, it's not like I bring in a preconceived, I get there and it's just I don't know, different version of a religion that I'm familiar with. No, it's like an open source, no pun intended. Does that make sense? Open source spirituality that is underlying all religions, right? At the source of their message.
Well, and I don't know when this is coming out, if it hasn't already, but I think it's mid year. There's that study that's supposed to publish where multiple religious leaders took psilocybin,
Really?
and none of them lost their faith. In fact, all of them had I saw the talk at the MAPS conference. All of them had their faith deepened and more renewed. So I very much appreciate what you're saying, Debbie, about there being this kind of like blank slate, so to speak, in spirituality. And at the same time, I think there is the potential for folks to come back to a more original understanding of their preferred spirituality. Because I absolutely respect someone's involvement in the Catholic Church or whatever, evangelicals for all that it matters, or whatever kind of religion that I may or may not have a context for or understand. But what is problematic is, just like you're saying, Jasmine, and you did as well, Debbie, when the dogma overrides the actual message, which is always love. It's always you are each other, and so whatever flavor that takes on, whatever garments you wear to feel like you're embodying that, then, thumbs up, rock it out, and, but at the same time, and this is not talked about in the psychedelic community nearly enough, or maybe it doesn't need to be talked about. I don't know. But Jasmine, you brought it up. Psychedelics have been used for dark magic or for spiritual warfare. Right. And so we in the psychedelic community maybe have a tendency to kind of glamorize psychedelics and see them as only beneficent, but they are just tools that can be used in a variety of ways. Now, I don't know. What do you think about this, Jasmine? I mean, do you feel like in their essence, kind of like all religions, at their essence, psychedelics are, good in and of themselves, and that, like religion, humans then turn and corrupt them? Or are they neutral? Kind of how do you think about that? Or have you given that much thought?
Yeah, I view them as kind of neutral. I think that they have the capacity to be used for good and for harm. And I think that, they can reinforce underlying patterns or break them down, So we talk a lot about ego, I guess, ego death and ego dissolution, but there is also like ego inflation that can happen through psychedelics, and they can be, it can go either way. They can be so reaffirming of your worldview, just as we were talking about religion, and I think that, they can be reaffirming, or they can be like, you need to change. You need to let go, change, dissolve this particular whatever pattern in your life and repattern. And I think the guidance around them is really important, and the support. And I think a point that I also will make is that, I've said in Western culture, I really don't feel like we have the frameworks to hold these experiences, and I think that the framework has been capitalism for a large part. It's like, oh, what do we do with this? Oh, let's monetize it. And I think, yeah, exactly. I mean, I read a piece, I guess, an essay about like, the mining that they're planning to do on the moon for minerals. It's like there's no part of this world that is untouched. And so what leaves the inner world is also capitalism is trying to pick away at it, and it includes these experiences, it includes these sacred plants. And, I think that they can be used as allies, but it also depends on right relation. And I think I mentioned that, I see these substances and these plants as tricksters in a way, and I think they all have different personalities. I subscribe personally to more animistic views, and I think they all have different personalities and essences, and, they have different qualities. And, I just think in the process of sense making around these experiences, for people who are just diving into them, it's just really important to have good support, because you could get a message really strongly, that you feel like, oh, I need to move city or something, or this, and maybe it's right. Maybe it is the right message for you, but I think there has to be kind of like a sitting with these big decisions, because I think that, there can be kind of a certain impulsivity around whatever messages arrive. And so I guess what I'm trying to say, I do think they're more benevolent than not, but I think that we just don't necessarily understand how to interpret the messages, for lack of, sorry, I'm going to cough. I spoke so much, my throat dried up, but, but yeah, just for lack of integrating that mystic visionary component into our culture, so I think just having solid people to support and care for you in whatever decision making thereafter, because you can see something and misinterpret it, and maybe that's part of the journey too, right?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up so much just in that comment alone. Joe Tafur, recently, I'm sure you've heard of Joe Tafur, ayahuasquero, and he medical doctor. He, in a recent talk I heard him give, he was saying that there is a study that's going to be published soon that is showing that across the board, despite the medicines that are used, that the most influential factor on a positive outcome is the facilitator, the space holder, because not first and foremost, I think that the energy, of that individual that is kind of bringing into the space, we underestimate what an impact that individual's energy has on the space, and therefore is a kind of a filter of information coming in a way. And also, like what you're talking about, this I think is extremely important, is in the integration. So if someone comes to you, if somebody has an experience and they're like, oh yeah, mushrooms told me I should, quit my job or whatever, I'm like, well, maybe we should wait a couple of weeks, or maybe we should talk it out. And there's something here to explore that's not such a, quick to jump scenario. But what you brought up that I think is, I would love to kind of tease out a little bit more. Debbie, we talk about this quite a bit. You're one of the main proponents of speaking in terms of a healthy ego, right? We talk in the psychedelic space. There's a lot of this discussion around kill the ego. The ego's all bad. And I love what you've brought into the conversation about a healthy ego and how that can be a real powerful tool for good in the world. So, I mean, can you kind of springboard off of that a little bit? And then let's hear Jasmine's thoughts on this idea of what a healthy ego might look like and represent.
Well, yeah, I think that there's, when we're born into this world, part of the purpose or part of what we take on or build is an ego to be able to survive in it to begin with. It goes awry maybe along the way with losing touch with the spiritual side of things. So, once you get to 7 and you've kind of shed, you've forgotten some more of that connection to the spiritual world and become full ego. And then you have to make a journey back to connect to the spiritual side, but making friends with it, ideally making friends with a healthy ego, not the ego driving your life, but partnering with your soul in a partnership, will get you, probably make the most of this life experience. Either way, I mean, I've seen people completely shed their ego and they can't survive. I mean, literally can't survive. So I don't think, hating it, and never is hating or disliking or anything, or, judging an ego in that way, is healthy. It doesn't help anything. So it's kind of like befriending it, understanding it, getting your true self, your spirit, your soul strong enough, that they can form a partnership and a friendship together.
Does that ever come up in any of your death doula work? I'm curious if just and maybe it's not spoken of as ego, but go ahead.
No, well, I would say that the ego, that's part of it really depends upon the person. If they have a strong ego, it's stronger than their spirit. It's much more difficult for them to make that transition. That's why I think, one of the benefits of the medicine of psychedelics is that it can strengthen your soul, your spirit, at least give it a voice or give it a vision, or, wake it up, however you want to describe it, so that if the ego is in control too much, that at least gives the opportunity to look at it in a different way and connect with that, and hopefully start a partnership, start a growth together.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I just have noticed that people, even in the therapy world, even this, what they call spiritual therapists, there was this movement of like, oh, the ego's bad. The ego's bad. And I never, got to get rid of that ego. And many of them that I know have come around to say, that's not a really good idea. So you've heard it as spiritual bypassing too. Like when people try to get rid of the ego by spirit, jumping right into the spiritual world, and they don't heal the ego. The ego has wounds. What we talk about in IFS too is like they're parts of us. They need healing. So if we can work together to heal those parts of the ego, they actually become good.
Mm-hmm.
They come
Yeah,
back.
I was also going to use the word spiritual bypassing. Yeah, it came to mind just because, yeah, I don't know. I'm really like, when I think about just kind of this denial of ego, I mean, the ego is our ally, just as the body is our ally. I guess the question of like, well, what part of us is really us, Is it the body? Is it the soul? Is it the ego? And I think they all are to some extent, but I think the function of the ego is to kind of, I don't know, keep us safe. And, it's our narrative and biographical self. And it really can serve that journey towards, like, I guess, spiritual realization. But it really needs to be tended to and cared for, because it's how we show up in the world, And, yeah, I've also seen, I have heard of someone, a friend of a friend who was a ceremonial facilitator, that got too far out in, I guess, smoking DMT and 5-MeO in particular. And I've heard of friends have this experience where it's just kind of like you're in a state without that ego. And I think Anne Shulgin talked about it as the death door. You see this something tempting, almost like a window into like, oh, but this not existing is just so blissful. I might as well continue to do that. I've heard 2 accounts of that, and one in which someone tragically drowned because they were in such a blissful state, and they just thought, let me just go into the water. And so I'm not trying. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that your ego is your ally in those situations, but also throughout this lifetime. And I think that, I don't know, I guess we're put here, I believe, in specific constellations, and there's things we need to work out on that narrative, biographical plane, on the relational plane. And just like you said, to just bypass over that and just head straight to the spiritual. I'm like reminded of a scene that I saw years ago in a Louis Theroux documentary where he's like in India, like staying with some Hare Krishnas. And there's this man who's just like, he's interviewing, but just like he talks about himself and just said, the old Leslie is dead. He's in the past, but he's like grinning and his eyes are wide and he doesn't look happy. And there's a sense of like, I've seen that in many people also in the psychedelic space. It's like, this hurts too much. I'm going to just push it over here because this other thing feels good. And I think I don't know. I believe personally it's a part of our work in our lifetimes to heal that wounding, to heal that pain, to tend to our, needs and desires in a loving way because they're there for a reason.
What's that? I mean, I think you're touching on it a little bit there, but can you expand on what you said, nurturing the ego, which is a really kind of wonderful phrase that I would love it if you could kind of just expand on that a little bit. What's that mean to you?
Yeah, I just feel like for whatever reason, we're all put here in a specific constellation with a specific constellation of like wounds, I don't know, challenges, strengths, whatever our personality looks like, and also our interpersonal relationships. And I think that to really nurture our ego is to kind of like lean into that selfhood, lean into all of those narratives, and to lean into like, I don't know, I guess just kind of like fulfilling arcs that we feel, for whatever reason. I don't know if I'm explaining it very well, but I think that
it kind of makes me think, so the spiritual world of before birth, and we were talking about after death, right? And where does the ego fit into that? But, if you've ever been around kids or babies that are born, and if you have more, they appear to come into this world with some kind of a personality or an ego. And I kind of believe that, how much you heal that, we talked about it before, how much you heal that, how much you work with that prepares you for then the transition back into, the other physical, otherworldly space. And maybe we carry that ego, that personality should never leave. It's what makes us an individual soul.
This has been one of the most interesting topics to me lately to just kind of explore, as I feel like I continually get, more healed in my ego and my spirit, and kind of like getting to the essence of who I am, right? And this Courtney having experienced Ananda before she was born, and being able to describe her personality when she was in utero, seems like there's something really valuable there, which is much of what it seems like Jasmine is kind of alluding to, in that, in nurturing and having that healthy ego, then we can get closer to that I think of it like a flavor. I don't know how to, I think of like, we come into this world, it's like a flavor has like a lot of nuance to it, right? You got all the smells and everything that's taken into a flavor. And so the healthier we get, the more we can embody that authentic flavor of our being. And then like what a wonderful big soup that can make for us all. So yeah, the conversation around ego, particularly in the psychedelic world, it's starting to make a bit of a turn, but it seems like there's more to be done there. And your work, Debbie, with the IFS groups and Sanctuary, and what I've heard of IFS and family constellations, when you say constellations, Jasmine, as well, seems to be a really valuable tool in helping people get more towards a healthier kind of baseline. I wonder, could you talk a little bit about the IFS work and what you see there, and how that maybe helps to nurture this ego, like Jasmine's suggesting?
Yeah. I mean, I see it, what I've seen and experienced it at, and I don't even know if they always describe it like this in the internal family systems world, but it's essentially your ego has many personalities. It has many parts to it. And so when you come in, it's solid, it's one. It doesn't have parts, it hasn't split yet. But as you go through life and your parents say, let's just say I'll take a young boy and says, "You're a boy, you can't cry. You're not allowed to cry," or your needs, your needs don't matter, or they don't get nurtured, whatever. These little wounds happen, and then parts of your ego split off, and one becomes a protector and maybe protects you ever from loving again. Because I just had somebody in the group the other day just talk about, they were born into addictive parents, and they took on these roles, and their ego became split off, where they just never would trust somebody again. They never would love. Well, internal family systems, instead of medicating it like you would possibly in the medical world, healthcare world, compassionately looks at that part and loves them and is curious and say, "Oh, what are you trying to do?" And, "Oh, you're trying to protect me from this. Yeah, you've done a great job." And I don't, even for myself, working with some of those parts, I don't try to get rid of them. I don't hate them, but say, "Hey, could you take on another role?" And your true self, I'll say your spirit or your soul, is present through all of this, having these conversations with these parts of the ego that need some kind of healing, that say, "Okay, you're safe now. So instead of doing that, let's work together and use your skills in this other way." It may sound woo, like, because at first you're talking to parts of yourself. So yeah, some people could go, "That's schizophrenic." But honestly, it's got the most profound healing, because it's actually listening to, loving to, and working with these parts of your ego to make them whole. So if you think of the word holy, it's really becoming a whole, your ego being whole and healed, and your higher self, your soul, whatever, being healed, and they're together now. You're one being.
So relating that to the end of life transition, it sounds like I'm seeing this kind of arc from birth to death that we have. We come in as this pure being, so to speak. We get influenced and tainted by, or, well, not tainted, we get influenced, just leave it there.
And I'll say
life.
Wounded, because wounded is for real.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough.
None of us get out of here without a wound.
But then if we can, if at some point in our lives we start to recognize that wounding, and we can intentionally engage with these parts of ourselves and heal, then that contributes to a more peaceful transition.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. More peaceful transition. And I would have to say, possibly, from what we talked about today, a more peaceful afterlife. Well, you were saying before, Eric, like, "Oh, you just pick up where you left off, right?" Or whatever. Wouldn't you want to do that?
Or next life, or concurrent life, since it's all happening simultaneously. There is no linearity.
Right. And by the way, the beautiful part of it too is that because we're all connected, it has rippling effects. You heal those parts of you, and boom, it's rippling through all kinds of relationships, and because you're living your life differently.
We had a call last night, one of the minister calls, and it's maybe 15, 18 people on the call, and there were only about 4 people that really spoke. But we've already been contacted by several people that were just silently on the call and expressed how hearing that conversation brought them so much release and healing, and that they were, and then so I start to think about like the Sunday services. And I've always thought about this with psychedelics, or not always, but for a long time, it's been like an understanding that we are each other. And as each of us individually heals, we are helping to heal the whole. And which maybe, I don't know, Jasmine, it seems like you have quite a bit of an understanding of indigenous understandings of psychedelics anyway, or plant medicines. And I wonder, is that a framework that exists like specifically within any of these kind of indigenous communities that you know of, or is this something that I suspect it's not brand new to just the Western experience?
Yeah, I think, without it's hard to draw from a particular indigenous culture and say they believe this or they don't, so I
Hmm.
can't
Hmm.
necessarily do that. But what I do understand is that for many indigenous cultures, and without homogenizing them, because they're all different, there are
Right.
so many, yeah. Um, I think that psychedelics, and I mentioned it earlier, just this Western model of like therapy and like the medicalization, it is very individually focused. Whereas I think in a lot of indigenous healing, I guess, ceremonies, and more than healing, just ceremonies, it's about the collective. It's rarely ever about, I mean, sometimes it's about an individual, like I think in the Native American church, like if someone has a birthday or it's like graduating into adulthood, or if a relative is really sick, there can be an individual focus. But a lot of the time, the ceremony, it's kind of about both, and but that there is a sense of like these medicines are collective community medicines. They bring people into cultural cohesion with one another. And so it's like, yeah, I don't know, it's a thing that solidifies your relationship with the others in your community, whether they're human or more than human others. So, I really think that without the words of like healing yourself heals the collective, there is a deeper recognition of like they're not separate for many indigenous cultures, And I think a lot of the maladies and ailments that we experience like are an echo of the larger system that we live within, the framework of capitalism. There's so much ecological destruction unfolding, there are wars unfolding, and I think COVID was a beautiful example of like, oh, you think over here in whatever, I live in Mexico, I used to teach English online, and I had like a Chinese student, and I remember her telling me about like being, locked away during COVID when it first broke out there, and just like describing that situation. And naively, I was just like, oh, but I'm so far away. And like, within a span of whatever, weeks, months, it's just a beautiful reminder, even though it was a very heavy, traumatic thing filled with so much grief globally. But I think it speaks of just our interconnection. And I think that, in Western ontologies, we have, and just science in general, we divide things, we reduce things to try and understand them. But I think that, in various other cultures, there's things have blurry edges, they blend together, there is a deeper dialogue with the other, and a recognition of like, we need each other, we are part of each other, we're part of the same thing.
Well, and I was going to say, when you were talking, Eric, about, even the religious people taking them together, or the benefit, or the mile marker of somebody having a really good psychedelic experience was who was assisting them, right? Who was sitting with them. But I also believe that a big difference is in the integration with community. I mean, even integrating individually, of course, integration is important, but the community part of it, and I think that's one of the things I appreciate most about Sanctuary, is the community part of it, because you truly do heal at a different level with a tribe, with community. Yeah,
absolutely. No, and that was a bit of a loaded question on my part, because I wanted to introduce just the idea that perhaps our modern homage, which is more like lip service to indigenous practices. Indigenous, again, there are so many practices. This is not one homogenous group, but when we speak of honoring the cultures where these medicines came from, that I don't think that involves nearly as much sending money to somebody in a foreign country as it means embodying some of the wisdom that was passed down through these traditions, that is a collective experience, that is a very blurred lines experience. I love that. And even in this idea of birth, life, death, we've been talking about this kind of thread that's been running throughout, is that the lines are blurred. The ego, we're talking about this, there's not a distinct sense of the ego and the spirit, that we really need an integrative, holistic approach to the life experience and psychedelics. And so it feels like we're moving in that direction with psychedelics. And I want to just say that individuals like yourselves are doing really important work in helping to expand that understanding, expand those definitions, which I am very deeply appreciative of, and very grateful to be in relationship and communication with both of you. And Debbie, I see the great work that you do all the time, and I just can't commend you enough for everything that you're doing in this very challenging space. The end of life, transition, my God, just the energy, the heart, the attention, the sincerity that it requires, massive respect. And Jasmine, just your speaking out and being so public and being so engaged with the psychedelic community and presenting different models of understanding than this kind of typical medical Western perspective is sorely needed and greatly appreciated. So thank you both for the work you're doing and for this wonderful conversation. Before we part out here, though, Debbie, you know the routine, and I'm going to ask you again. Jasmine, you can answer second, so you can have a little bit of time to think about it. But Debbie, today, what does psilocybin say to you?
Oh, wow. Well, can I relate to my sacrament experience this
You
last
absolutely,
weekend?
of course. That's when it's talking the loudest.
That's what it was, and it's very clear in my mind. I think it was saying to me that God, the source or whatever. Well, can I give it a little background?
You just go
I
all
was
you talk all
grieving.
you need.
Okay, I was grieving very heavily something, and in a very non-judgmental, just pure energy grief, and said to the source, "Do you ever feel this? I mean, do you feel this stuff?" And the source went back, "Well, yeah, I do. I feel it through you because you are me. And I am so grateful for you to have these feelings and to share them with me."
Hmm.
That was very profound to me. That was psilocybin definitely told me that, or through that. And
So how would
it's
you
pretty
sum that up?
life-changing for me.
How would you sum that up then? Psilocybin says what?
Psilocybin says that God and I are one, and we are experiencing all of this together. There's no good, bad. We're experiencing it as one.
Thank you.
It's all good.
It's all good, even when it's not. It's all good.
Yeah.
Jasmine, what does psilocybin say to you today or any day?
Yeah, I think in the context of this conversation, just around kind of death and birth and rites of passage, we've spoken about, I guess, finding meaning in the ego. Yeah, psilocybin says, listen deeply, learn how to be a good ancestor. I think, yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Learn how to be a good ancestor.
Very good. Love that.
And I had a journey a few months ago, just kind of like reflecting on what it means to make home in this world, like, or find home, or create, this sense of safety and love to really make home in a world kind of in the midst of like war and climate change and all of these things that are causing us so much grief. And I got the message that life has found a good home in your body. So I really think becoming a good ancestor is honoring the life that exists to make, that animates me. So yeah, that's
beautiful.
what psilocybin says.
That is a thought I have never had. I am going to entertain it a little longer. Thank you.
Absolutely.